Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. It's 4:38. Nice to see everyone. First off, we have a consent agenda, which includes, our prior minutes. No, can't be right.
I put prior minutes in policy readings.
Yeah.
So we could be
Oh,
caught up.
okay. So we have our prior minutes from January 17th, and we have a second read on a number of policies. Is there any discussion or questions about either of those? No, that's good. Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve that consent agenda. We'll do that by roll. Kat?
Aye.
Mary is an aye. You want to abstain since she's come here, okay. All right, so recognition of visitors, I don't see anyone other than staff and board in the virtual realm, is that correct, Courtney?
That is correct.
Okay, oh great, and here comes Morgan. Perfect. So we'll just let Akua settle in and Morgan settle in.
Time you we're about to get to the slideshow. We could actually go to a slideshow and I can get us started while he's settling in.
Great. And is this a slideshow that you can share via email as well?
So we're going to get started talking about, we think you know why we're all here. Our NMB and our ER budgets were defeated at town meeting day. So because part of their budgets include the SU assessment, it only makes sense for us to also take an opportunity to look at this budget as well. So that's why we call it this special meeting. So before we dig into the budget, we want to just back up. It's been a little while since we built this budget, and hopefully there are people watching this meeting to be informed in our community. So we're going to give a little context. So I'll start out by just reorienting us to our general budget objectives. We tried very hard to make sure that the priorities that we set within the supervisory union are tied to our three big board goals. The first being that all students will be reading on grade level by the end of grade 3 by 2027. The second board goal is really centered on beginning with a class of 2028. All students will be graduating based on demonstrating a body of evidence related to proficiency of the portrait of a learner indicators. And the third board goal is around all students demonstrating proficiency in the SEL grade band priority standards by the end of 2027. This is some historical data for you to take a look at, just in terms of the pink reflects our student counts in ER, and the purple reflects our student counts in the Northern Mountain Valley. The two things to note there, that dip in 2020 is reflective of the number of students we lost in that pandemic year. So that decline in population is factored into how Morgan projects what's coming out in future years. So that'll drop off in the next couple of years, and so we'll get a more accurate read at where our projections are really heading. And one thing to note about this that I think is important for our communities to understand, there are certain communities in Vermont that are seeing a pretty significant decline in student population, and that is not the pattern that we are seeing here. In fact, we are seeing some increases in student population within FNESU. Turn it back to you, Morgan, if you're ready.
Sure. So when we started the process, there were some high-level considerations that we had driving the development of all three budgets. Increase in social emotional needs, we discussed that quite a bit. Health insurance premium increases 16.5% basically, on top of a 12.5% increase the prior year. and that is something that the board has no control over in terms of negotiation. Act 127 benefits both of our communities roughly equally, and we will go into that a little bit later. And then specific to the supervisory union, we are seeing this year an additional $300,000 as part of the census block grant, which is the new model for funding special ed in Vermont. And we do anticipate similar increases for the next 3 years before that levels off. We've also talked quite a bit about the end of the ARP-ESSER grants. We have 14 people, not quite that much in terms of FTE, but about 14 staff members who are covered in whole or in part this year by the ARP-ESSER grant, and just wanted to lay out in more detail where the current plan is for distributing them. So 2 family engagement coordinators have been brought into the NMV budget. Those are all of these are existing people in existing positions. On the Enosburg-Richford side, 3/4 of a family engagement coordinator, an assistant principal, piece of an assistant principal at Richford Elementary, and then the high school is taking on almost an entire staff member from the Flexible Pathways Academy. And again, I'll pause here and say this is the plan that was voted on March 5th, and so the starting point for the discussions for all 3 boards. Moving into the Franklin-Northeast General Fund budget, the Director for the Advancement of Educational Equity, we would only be pulling in 3/4 of her for this year because we are allowed to leave her in the ESSER grant through the end of September, and so kind of easing that transition. Similar with the 3 instructional coaches, that should actually read 2.25 on the slide, and we'll get that fixed. And then the remaining 3.2 of the remaining Flexible Pathways staff. So those are the remaining teachers in that program were kept in the Franklin-Northeast budget. We also have an SEL coordinator who's paid out of ESSER. It's a half-time position, and that half-time we are going to be able to move into the consolidated federal grants that we have at the SU. And then I'm listing this as a cut half-time Flexible Pathways staff. That's actually the principal job that Gab is doing, and as you all know, she's now moving to Director of Instruction and Learning.
Or can I just back up 1 second? I want to make sure that it's clear that the Director, Instructional Coaches, and Flexible Pathways staff are prorated. You said that for Michelle's position, but...
The instructional coaches and Michelle's position are both prorated because they are still able to be covered by...
Okay, but not FPA.
Not FPA because they're on a school year contract, and so we don't really start paying them until the beginning of September.
And Morgan, who, with Gab moving out of that position, who now leads the Flexible Pathways?
Great question.
So Gab has
We're
still
still-
been doing most of that in addition to the role that we hired her for this year because we did not backfill that position this year.
But so we are looking to fill that position?
No.
Good. Move on. Act 127, I know we've talked about this at your local meetings in the past, but I think we need to continue to sort of put this out there, explain it to our communities. In Vermont, we have got a constitutional requirement to equal access to funding for all students. This came out of the court case that ended in the Brigham decision in about 1990 something, 96, 97 maybe. What that law corrected was prior to that, each district's budget was paid for based on its grand list. So if you had a town like a Stowe that had a very big grand list, not a huge number of kids, they would have a tax rate that was, measured in pennies or dimes rather than in dollars. Whereas if you had a town like Berkshire that had a very low grand list and a relatively high number of kids, their tax rates were up to, 2 something. And those tax rates supported much fewer opportunities for those kids. And so Brigham changed that, moved us to a statewide system. And part of that process was that they decided they were going to count kids based on educational need rather than just one kid per kid. And so kids who lived in poverty, kids who were English language learners, a few different categories were given additional weights. There wasn't a lot of science backing that up. They were just kind of going with what their gut said in terms of what a student should cost a district. Act 127 basically corrected that by hiring UVM to conduct a study and really get some data behind, okay, what does it cost to educate a kid who doesn't hear English at home? What does it cost to educate a kid who is coming to school living in poverty? Those weights didn't change the underlying formula for setting tax rates, but they changed one of the numbers that goes into it. And so districts like our two up here were able to raise significantly more money for the same tax rate because we were able to count those kids. Districts who had seen a benefit under those old weights that they shouldn't have been getting historically, we're going to see a pretty big either a decline in their budget for the same tax rate or a much higher tax rate for the same budget.
So the theory behind that was to try to equalize that a little bit. So reducing some of the spending in some of the more historically advantaged districts and increasing some of the spending and opportunities in historically disadvantaged districts like ours. So when we're looking at the visual that you'll see in a little bit, there's a pretty large variance in terms of the per pupil spending, and the whole idea behind Act 127 was to be able to give more equitable opportunities without it costing communities like ours more on the tax rate.
And so part of that for those communities that were going to be losing tax capacity, they had built in a soft landing over 5 years that would allow them basically to cap their tax rate by a certain amount each year while they transitioned to that, what I'll call their real tax rate. What quickly came to light in December was that there were a handful of districts, not necessarily those that were disadvantaged by the law, but some that were disadvantaged by that law, who were able to add pretty significant levels of spending to their budget without raising their own tax rates. And so there was no throttle for them to add things that were probably legitimate, replacing a roof, what have you, but things that they would not have included in their budget if they had to pay for it. Because of the Ed Fund being a statewide system, when they add that spending, it has to come from somewhere, and it would come from the districts like ours, which were not ever anywhere near that cap. And so the legislature recognized that problem and pretty quickly moved to solve it with House Bill 850, which is now signed and now is in law. And that was what's caused all the recent chaos in the state. One of the provisions of that, first of all, it took away that tax cap, and so the towns that were supposed to get a soft landing were still going to get a soft landing, but it was going to be in terms of they got X number of cents off their tax rate rather than being able to spend whatever they want for a fixed tax rate. So when they made that move, we were not in a position where we had to pay for those increases anymore. They were going to be shared to the districts that actually increased their spending. It also gave towns the ability to pull back a warned budget. And that was there anticipating that some of the towns who had put in $5, $7, $8 million into their budget thinking they weren't going to pay for it would want to pull those budgets back and rewarn a lower budget so that they weren't bringing a huge tax increase, unnecessary tax increase to their voters. what that means is that those budgets being pulled back and rewarned, coupled with several districts that vote late in the year anyway, coupled with all the budget defeats that happened this year, the state is in a position where they really don't know yet where the yield needs to be set. And that yield is the last figure that sets the local tax rates. So we will be talking about that a little later in the presentation, but there's a lot more uncertainty this year in terms of the yield, whereas in a normal year when most of the budgets are warned by this time and voted on by this time, and most have passed by this time, we have a pretty solid idea of where those tax rates are going to end.
So there's a language thing I just want to point out, because in this new model, we are a system that is now considered advantaged. And we're advantaged by the additional pupils in those weights. So sometimes I think I'm trying not to use that language, like we've been historically disadvantaged, now
Right.
advantaged by some increased capacity with those pupil weights. And now districts who've been historically advantaged are now considered disadvantaged districts. So it's just, the language matters, and I just think that's important to point out, because I think that there is a narrative that's happening in the media, and I do think that when these terms are used loosely, it's very easy to confuse which districts are being referenced in terms of the narrative that's being set at the state level.
It's a bit like if Dominic had been sent to jail for a crime he didn't commit 5 years ago, and we found out that actually Aaron was the one who committed the crime. Dominic's released from jail and he's now considered advantaged, or we call him advantaged because he now has his freedom, even though he was serving a term that he shouldn't have been serving. And Aaron is disadvantaged because she finally got caught. So hopefully next year we won't have to talk about that. And I'd like to point out I've had worse metaphors that didn't make it to the board.
That did go through my mind.
Moving on. So staffing changes, and again, this is in the budget as approved by this board. We have an additional English language teacher in the budget, and that is really the only new position to the SU budget. In what's kind of the more general central office budget, we talked about moving those FPA teachers out of ESSER into the general fund, moving the instructional coaches into the general fund. Again, it's only 2.25 FTE of the three of them in FY25. Similar, the Director for Advancement of Educational Equity, only 0.75 this year, with the remaining quarter staying in ESSER. We can talk about the Directors of Instruction and Learning and that model a little bit later if we want to get into those details. The tech integrationist position, this was a position that is in the NMV budget this year and is hired out of NMV. We proposed moving that to the SU and taking it out of NMV because that person has capacity to serve all 9 of our schools, and gave the ER budget opportunity not to backfill a vacancy that occurred this year. So overall, it's probably a net drop of 1 person, but we're bringing it to the SU and kind of sharing that savings across those 2 districts. And then finally, we have a custodian that's working half-time over at STEPS, and then they're working in our office as well, cleaning that. It replaced a contracted service we had at our office, and it was a new position at STEPS. We were just grabbing people as we needed to over there. And it's also a position, I would say, that's our first go-to person if we have vacancies in other schools that we can't fill. We send them there as sort of a sub. Dawn in food service is proposing a 0.7 drop to FTE. There's no entire person associated with that. That's really a drop in hours across a couple of people. And then in the special ed budget, overall, start by saying overall the budget itself is down pretty significantly because primarily those transportation and tuition bills were no longer paying at the scale that we were in the past. In terms of staffing, proposing an increase of just over 1 FTE, and you can see on the slideshow, and I will share that, kind of where the pluses and minuses are. Her budget moves pretty dramatically year to year based on the needs of kids and the availability of people who are out looking for jobs with these relatively specific skill sets.
I think one thing I'll add there is by creating our own internal programs, and I think you mentioned it, I just want to say a little more. By creating our own internal programs, we have been able to realize much greater efficiency and better outcomes for our students. So we have built 4 alternative programs within the SU. And so at this time, I believe we still have no students out in alternative placements. We did this in a time where our access to those placements was incredibly limited, almost non-existent, huge wait list. So out of necessity, we built these, and what we found is they're much more efficient because we have no more transportation costs. And some of those were tens of thousands of dollars per pupil previously. And we are able to do this much more efficiently in-house, and kids are having more success transitioning back into the local schools because we can do a gradual transition back, a supported gradual transition back. So I know, Michelle, I'd asked you to pull those numbers just for context, or Morgan, I'm not sure if you have them or if Michelle has those.
Go ahead.
I have them, if you
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
want me to share them.
Sure.
So the price comparison, if we were going to send a student to SOAR Learning Center, the tuition is $71,181 plus $9,535 for transportation, as well as their extended school year, which is summer school, which is an additional $3,756 for a total of $84,462. That's our closest school that we tend to use the most. We were going to send us out of district because it's in St. Albans, where the rest of them are Chittenden County. And they what the cost of steps is for a student in FNESU is now $47,629.
With no additional
So-
transportation costs.
Correct.
And when we had access to those in Chittenden County, they were closer to 90 to 100,000 in tuition and
It's like
20 to 30 in transportation.
Is 127,000 for a student that went to Belkate, or Laraway, which is fairly close to us, is 100,000.
So the reality is there still will be students that have that level of more intensive need than what we can support in-house, but we have not, there are no placements right now that are available, or the need is being met in our STEPS programs. You want me to jump to the next one, Morgan?
Sure.
So as a result of town meeting day, 30 school budgets were defeated in Vermont. 14 school budgets have a regularly scheduled vote that's after town meeting. So some of those are starting to trickle in, but there are still some that, Essex Westford, for example, they always vote in April. So there are some who just haven't had their first vote yet. There were, when we talked about H 850 earlier, there were 8 school boards that made decisions to delay their budget votes. So we have 8 budgets out there that are delayed to a later date. I do know that there is at least one that I know of that comes up later this week. So we'll start seeing results from those as well. So when we're thinking about where do we go from here, there are some things through the management lens that we really need to lean into and consider. So as we're developing the second version of our budget, some things that we need to know is that teacher contracts, this is all in our master agreement, teacher contracts must go out no earlier than April 1st and no later than May 15th. As you all know, we have worked really hard on retaining educators, and we advocated to get that date at April 1st because we wanted to know what our staffing structures were going to look like as early as possible, because the later you get into the hiring season, the harder it is to fill those positions. And as per the contract, teachers have 15 days to sign their contract when you offer it, and they can ask for an additional 15-day extension. So if we offer on April 1, for some teachers who are looking, we wouldn't know if they're returning until May 1st. So that puts us in the middle of May before we're able to start interviewing for some of those positions. So I feel strongly that we still should be aiming for April 1st to send out the majority of our teacher contracts. Not all, and I'll explain why in a moment. April 15th is the deadline for reduction in force. So at your, I think it was at your January board meeting, you voted to have me let the union know that there's a potential contemplation of a reduction in force. It doesn't mean that you will reduce any positions, but that you're contemplating it. So the union is aware of that now. But by April 15th, if there's a teacher who is at risk of being reduced, we have to notify them as per the master agreement. So I'm actually I'm bumping that up internally because I really want to get those contracts out on April 1st. So if there's anyone who is at risk, and the boards will have to decide how comfortable they are in terms of positions. There may be some that are at risk in round 2, and then the boards may direct me to notify more than that in case the budgets are defeated again in round 2, and if we have to cut any more deeply, we would need to consider that when we're offering those contracts. So right now, Jamie is working on producing seniority lists by district and by SU. So there's language specific in the master agreement that has to do with their licensure area and the job that they're working in. So we'll be looking at all of that in the coming days. Another thing to just point out as we're leaning into Budget 2.0 is that we are in the midst of support staff negotiations, so that has not been concluded yet. So that's an important consideration in this as well. One thing that I would like to just talk about briefly, and I won't go on over everything that's on this slide, but I think that I've certainly heard some things since budgets were defeated, and I want to try to clarify the central office. That seems to be the mystery is what we do at a central office. So there are a lot of functions that happen in a supervisory union central office, and we have there's a law that was passed. Help me remember I don't remember which law it was. Act. Do you remember the number?
153.
It was a while
Maybe.
ago. We were forced to centralize certain functions like special education needed to come in to the supervisory union, transportation needed to come into the supervisory union. So when we think about what we offer throughout our supervisory union, there are a lot of things that we do for efficiency's sake, because we can do it cheaper at the supervisory union than they could if they were doing it at each individual local building. So we do a lot of the budgeting, human resources, curriculum development, professional development, all of the special ed services, all of the food services, all of the transportation. We work on group purchasing, technology, trying to get streamlined in terms of, contracts related to purchasing technology and the licenses that go along with that in overall district-wide planning. So there are efficiencies that are realized when you're looking at it as a whole system scale rather than at a school level scale, and operationally we could do a better job in that way. Another thing to think about is when you think about, when we have high teacher turnover, it's really important. There are not a lot of people going into education right now. That's the sad reality is our colleges are reporting that there is lower enrollment than ever in terms of people that are entering the education field. So we are not only onboarding new teachers, a lot of times we're onboarding teachers that don't have the training before they start with us, and we're giving them the training while they're here. They're working on getting their teacher certification while they're in the job. And that's different than how it has historically been. So it's more important than ever to provide instructional coaching for those people as one way of an example. If we were not doing that at the central office level, there would be additive spending. So people in each district would be like, you know, we could use some instructional coaching. So they might look to hire a half-time instructional coach, can't find one, so then they think about, well, if I make it full-time and build it in the budget, maybe we'll be able to find one. So it's that kind of rounding up effect that grows inefficiencies, where we're able to do it from our level and say the data shows you could use this much of an instructional coach and you could use this much, and it doesn't result in 6 or 7 or 8 instructional coaches being needed across the organization. So the other idea about the central office functions is that, you know, we want to help principals be as effective as they can. So we want to take things off their plate as much as we can. When I was the principal of Berkshire, there was no facilities director, and I spent a lot of my time dealing with boilers and dealing with a water system that I actually was technically the owner of. We provided water to the school, the town clerk, and the town garage, and I spent a lot of time doing those functions, just as one example, and that was all time that I couldn't spend focusing on teaching and focusing on student learning. So our goal in some of these centralized functions is to say, let's take some of those duties and responsibilities off of the principals, so the principals are not having to contend with technology pieces or food service or transportation or facilities. All of those functions, early education, after school program, those are functions that we take care of, everything associated with those, so that they can focus on teaching and learning in their buildings. What the research shows is that the most important factor when it comes to student learning is the teacher. So a teacher that's in the 75th percentile of effectiveness can contribute to an additional 4 months increase in student learning in reading and math within a school year. An effective principal in the 75th percentile can contribute to another 3 months of increased student performance in literacy and in math across the school year. So if we can if we can kind of protect our principals from some of the other noise, like Title IX duties and responsibilities that we try to take on within our supervisory union and all those other things I just mentioned, the goal is that they could be focusing on being instructional leaders in our building to continue to work to develop those teachers so they can be most effective for our students. So I will not read all of this, but we've tried to take a crack at saying, like, these are the things that land on you when you're trying to run a system like the system we're trying to run. So there are federal laws and regulations that we're responsible for attending to and making sure that we're in compliance with all of these pieces. There are state laws and regulations that we're also responsible for making sure that we're attending to. There are also district and SU policies and priorities that we're working on. We talk about those pieces a lot here, especially at this FNESU board meeting. And then there are also centralized functions where we're working to really kind of streamline and build efficiencies within our systems. So all of those pieces are the pieces that we're trying to hold, and we're trying to hold as much of that from landing on our schools as possible. So again, they can focus on the teaching and learning. Sometimes we have to let some of those things come through because we need them. We need them to do something, or we need them to produce something in terms of data or other things so that we can meet our obligations in those pieces. But all of those are typically not visible for people that look at the central office. And I think it's hard for people to conceptualize the kind of work that we're doing in our office to support our schools. And we're actually not all that small anymore. We looked at the data, and Morgan, was it 13th? I think we are the 13th largest system in the state of Vermont. So I think we have a perception that we run the small system. We're not all that small comparatively. We have almost 2,000 students in 9 schools. So I hope that's helpful context.
And I would also add that relative to a lot of other central office administrations, ours is pretty lean compared to comparable systems. I mean, it's really nice to make that visible. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding in the community around the complexity that runs in the background in order for all the good work to happen in each of the 9 buildings. And that it is a kind of like, you know, kind of beautifully interwoven system, and one that really relies on the other.
Yes.
And we could not do it without a strong central office.
Thank you, Mary.
So this is Lynn's favorite chart to show you. It's in the annual report as presented up on the big screen. And this is showing current year spending, so FY24 spending divided by this new long-term weighted average ADM, so those new pupil weights. And this gives you a per pupil comparison for each of the districts in the state, and is really the only credible number to use to compare spending from one system to another. So in the statewide number, or the statewide graph, you'll see lowest spending is at 8,000 at the bottom. The highest spending district is about 18,000 per kid up at the top. The red lines on this scattered throughout are our colleagues in Franklin County. So you can see where their spending is relative to ours. There are 2 black lines in the middle. The higher one is the statewide average, and the one below that is the Franklin County average. So you can kind of get an idea of how we're doing in terms of average, and that will equalize out some of the little teeny tiny districts that throw the numbers off. And then you'll see 18th from the bottom is Enosburg-Richford in blue on this chart, and 12th from the bottom is NMV, also blue towards the bottom. And then we also looked at this, starting to use the data that we're gathering for FY25. So on the left-hand side, you will see just the bottom 20 in that chart that we showed you prior. So again, this is the current year spending, current year number of kids, and the 2 red lines are where Enosburg, Richford, and NMV come in compared to those bottom 20. If you look to the right, this is what we know of FY25 ed spending per pupil. So in the case of the lines that are in green, those are districts that have passed a budget, and so we're pretty solid that the numbers that they have there are correct. The 2 in black are proposed budgets, but neither of those districts have voted yet, so a little uncertainty there, but we at least know what they're proposing to bring to their voters. The 6 lines in red all have defeated budgets, so they are all having meetings similar to ours now about deciding where to go and what to do to a budget to rewarn it and get something passed from the voters. If these all had passed on town meeting day and there were no systems that were higher that saw big cuts and so brought their per pupil spending down below what you see in these bottom 20. Enosburg would be now coming in at, I think it's 10th, and NMV would now be coming in at 9th from the bottom. So you'll see that even before those districts presumably make cuts and bring back a new budget to the voters, we are already a few steps farther down in the basement than we were when we started this year.
And the reality is those 2 red lines are the budgets that we put to voters that were defeated. So any work that we do tonight at this meeting, at the ER meeting, and the next week in the NMV meeting, that further reduces our spending, we can expect that we're going to see ourselves drop further down that list because all but 1 have been approved below us. So one other interesting thing I'd just like to point out, in the systems that are below us, Morgan, Stratton, Holland, and Ira are all non-operating districts, so they tuition all of their students. They don't have They don't have schools that they're running. Holland had a budget defeat. It's peculiar to me because they have no real control over their budget. They have X number of students and they have a tuition rate, and they voted that down. So I'm not sure what will happen with that budget. So as we're thinking about our budget decisions, I know we need to be responsive to the voters, and at the same time, it is, Morgan jokes this is my favorite graph. It is the graph that I use the most to tell our story, but it's my least favorite because it actually hurts my heart a little to think about how we compare to the rest of the state. And I know that our communities struggle with taxes, and we've tried to be as efficient and economical as we can over the years, and we have kept our spending really low. That's something when Act 46 happened, when we sat there at the state board meeting up in the Northeast Kingdom, they said to us, your systems are incredibly efficient. You've got to work on the excellence piece. You've got to work on those opportunities. Act 127 was built for systems like ours who have been historically underfunded because our communities have not been able to afford us to spend more. So that additional capacity that we had in there to increase these opportunities, it's still, we were very careful about how much we added. We added spending and still dropped down several steps to 9th and 10th lowest. And if we drop too much further down, the only schools that are likely to be below us are non-operating schools in the state. So I think we need to make some budget decisions that reduce our spending, but at the same time, it's really sad because it feels like we are in a race to the lowest spending in the state, and I feel like our kids deserve more than that. And so I hope that we can keep that in the balance of trying to be responsive to our taxpayers, helping them to understand the tremendously complicated funding structure and our reality for our students, because it's important to find that balance between the two.
We'll go quickly through these next 3 or 4. These are the pie charts that we show you kind of throughout the budget development process. This is just reminding you about where we spend our money and that our budgets are primarily people that we hire in red, and then services in green, which are for the most part people that work for someone else but work for us. So things like the transportation contract. About to the next one, Courtney. This is also what we do, so this will give a sort of better idea of the work that we do at the supervisory union. So special education in red is that biggest chunk. The next biggest ones are food service and transportation. And I know at the local board meetings, you've heard me continue to point out that those are the 3 that are almost 2/3 of our budget. We do have some student support and instructional support. A lot of that is tied to the alternative programs. School administration, general administration, central services are, they're not insignificant, but they're relatively small pieces of the pie compared to those big 3. And then this is a chart that we had not used in the past, but we're working on getting out there and refining. And it's looking at the supervisory union budget, but looking at it through the lens of where we spend our money. And so we've pulled out food service and transportation again between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock on the pie chart. Those are areas where, they're serving all kids, but we don't have the ability to look at a food bill and say this much is going to Berkshire and this much is going to Enosburg Elementary. The dozen or so small lines around the top are areas where we can identify specifically where a staff member is benefiting a specific school. So that would be your special educators, that would be school psychologists, folks who have a regular schedule where we can say, yeah, this person is in Montgomery these X number of days a week. The about 1/3 that's remaining, listed here as central office, are all the functions that we've not yet been able to tie to a school. So some of that will be kind of your typical central office services. Lynn's salary, my salary, Jamie, Dominic. It does include some special education services such as OT and PT, areas where we have staff on payroll, but they are truly during the course of a year moving where there is student need. So we can't say at the outset this OT person is going to spend 4 hours a week at Enosburg High School every week. We're just deploying them where the need is. Similarly, the two English language learner teachers are in there. The instructional coaches are in there because we don't know where the new teachers necessarily are going to be hired at this point in the budget process, or where, you know, struggling teachers who need some of their help are going to pop up during the schools. We can work on refining that further to the extent that we can, but I feel like we've had a lot of conversations at this board around the efficiency piece in terms of holding people like the English language learner teachers here rather than in the districts. And so a lot of those folks we just may not be able to do that in a defensible way.
So now we're at a place where we need guidance from the board about where we're gonna go from here. So, you know, it's been just under a week. Morgan and I have spent a lot of time together looking at all three of these budgets and thinking about what are some changes that we could make within these budgets. There is one last piece, Morgan, that I do think is worth noting, in that we said we would come back to that, and that's around the yield. So the theory is, with 30 budgets that were defeated across the state, most of those districts are going to reduce spending. For some of them, it is pretty likely that the reduction is going to be substantial, because there was spending when that 5% tax rate cap was in effect, that several systems chose not to delay the vote and pull that spending out, and now there's a one-to-one relationship with their spending and their tax rate. So for when there's spending that is pulled out of those budgets and the obligations across the state start to decline, our dollar yield, we will start to see grow. And as our dollar yield grows, our tax rate will go down. So we're in a peculiar position because we have on the ER side a $1.10 district tax rate, and I'm rounding, so I know there are more numbers after the $1.10. And I think it's $1.29. Is it no, that was not. That was on the, what was it on the NMB side?
It is also close to that.
Okay, I was thinking about the Richford piece. So as that yield grows, our tax rates are going to start to go down, and as the tax rates go down, we approach that $1 floor. And I'm gonna have Morgan talk about the floor, because as we're cutting, we wanna be thoughtful about that piece.
So the way that tax rates are calculated is, you know, we basically take spending divided by the number of kids, divided by the yield, and that gets you your tax rate. Per Vermont statute, that tax rate is not able to go below $1. It's a floor that's in there because you might have, you know, the Gores might not have any kids some year, and so they don't really have any expenses, but the state still wants them to participate in this statewide education funding system. A place like, you know, you saw the Holland up there, those non-operating districts may not actually ever legitimately get to that dollar in terms of what they're actually spending. And so we brought this up with NMV, and we'll go into a little more detail tonight with the Enosburg-Richford board. But we're sort of getting to the theoretical possibility where the yield goes up, which drives our tax rate down, and cuts to the budget also drive our tax rate down. If we hit the point where we go below $1, our tax rate will stay $1. And any amount you cut, you're still raising that money, you're just raising it and sending it into the greater system. And so it's something that we want you to be aware of in case it comes up when we have further meetings around this. We will obviously watch the yield and watch that as it changes over the next 2 or 3 weeks. It'll probably change pretty significantly. But we didn't want that to be a surprise to any of the boards when we come and tell you, hey, you can't cut any more money out of your budget.
So when we did some planning for how we approach the second round of budget, our thinking is that we would propose budgets that would be voted on April 30th in both districts. I think that at first we were thinking it was the same morning period as a typical town meeting day budget. We've since learned for a re-vote, it is slightly shorter, quite a bit shorter actually. So we could vote a little sooner. It's complicated on the ER side, which we'll talk about tonight because you also had your authority to vote, to borrow, voted down as well. So we think we still need the longer warning on the ER side. So the reality is if we voted on April 30th, we could turn another budget around pretty quickly. The hope is that other districts are going to go first. And as they're voting their budgets, the yield should continue to be responsive to a declining demand on the ed fund. So that should help inform us. And if we get to that place where we have cut too much from our budgets, we'll just want to have a conversation at that point. So I don't think any of us really want to be in that place where we're cutting and it's not going to impact the tax rate for our communities. It's just cutting opportunities for the kids. So where do you want to go from here, Mary? Should we jump into some conversations?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it might be helpful if, this is it for your slideshow.
So we've, I mean, to talk
Yeah.
about some of the things we've looked at
Yeah.
within the budget. Morgan went back, we looked at the pieces in the budget that were added by ESSER or positions that are little changes that we feel like we could pull out. I will say I am not in favor of pulling all of these out, and some are much more painful than others. We've listed anything that was added in ESSER, but we're kind of going in order. So I think an easy reduction that we could make is Morgan went over the numbers related to food service and thinks that we could reduce that portion of the budget by $55,000. So that's one place that we feel that we could pull some money out. We had budgeted and haven't filled, we already have in this budget, our existing budget, an HR assistant position, and we have not filled that position. So that's money that we could also pull out. I think that is, with everything in benefits, around $93,000. Leah, we've talked about the number of days that Leah's working. This board has talked about hiring for co-director position. We can't do that. It's not in the budget. So we are pulling back on that request of the board. Leah, we're really thankful, is staying with us. We would like to move Leah into the assistant curriculum director role and reduce her days from 260 to 220, which is something that Leah wanted to do as well. So that could bring us down some there as well, around 20,000. Morgan, I'm gonna have to ask you to talk about the theory around the after-school program.
Sure. So right now, both of your local budgets carry a big line item for the after-school program. And so that is used primarily for staffing, I'm gonna guess. But those are contributions from the general fund into the after-school program. We also, at the SU level, get a Medicaid grant based on the time that special educators spend providing services to eligible kids. Doreen works with the special educators to send that through the black box that is Medicaid that I don't fully understand. But we get a certain chunk of revenue back from the Medicaid program each year into the supervisory union. Historically, we have been using that just to cover some of the salaries for some of your guidance counselors. So it's pushed back to the local level, but it's not done in, let's say, the cleanest way possible. So what we started talking about was keeping that Medicaid money at the supervisory union, directing that or allocating that to the after-school program, and then because of that, we would push your guidance counselors back fully into your local budgets, which is arguably where they should be, and then take out that that after-school assessment or that after-school local connection. If we did that, we'd need to talk to Heather about this because we're pulling this stuff together in real time right now. It would likely not be the same amount of money that she asked for in the two budgets, but the Medicaid money comes with much more flexibility that I think would benefit her program. And we did confirm that it does count as the match that she needs to show to pull down her 21C grant money. We think other systems are using the Medicaid money.
The other conversations that we had today centered around our Flexible Pathways Academy. We're one of only 2 systems in the state that try to maintain a fully virtual option for kids post-pandemic, and that has served us quite well, not only for the families who have participated in that program, but also for our special education alternative programs. Those educators have been able to be the teachers for the kids in the FPA. So we've taken a look at how many people are, how many students are still in FPA. So I asked Gab to give me some numbers today. We have, I left it on my desk, so this is from memory, 10 students K through 6. We have 7 students in the 7 and 8 part of FPA. So one of the things we talked about was not offering FPA for the K through 6 population, which would reduce staffing, reduce an interventionist. We would keep one virtual teacher to support K through 6 in our alternative programs, but not offer that as a fully virtual option for other students. The 7 and 8 was interesting because we realized we need a part of a teacher to do not in person, but live literacy instruction for our students in STEPS. And because we're offering it that way, we could also offer it to kids in 7th and 8th grade that are in FPA, and it would be cost neutral because we'd have to pay for that teacher anyway. And those kids in 7 and 8 in the FPA, they naturally are already getting the advising piece of Cynthia Holt's support of them. So it'd be a small piece of her that would remain to support those 7th and 8th graders. So that's another piece that could reduce the budget by $207,000. Did I do that right, Maureen? $217,100.
The changes to the FPA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be reduction of that interventionist and then like reducing the other staffing structures to just keep the one virtual teacher for STEPS. And then, there's other things that you have in your budget that these are already, well, this one is not hired yet, is the one full-time English language multilingual teacher. So I had Michelle pull some data for all of you, and I think I probably have enough to go around. So she gave us some data over the years, how our numbers have changed. So you can see that our newcomers, they're called monolingual learners, in 21-22 we had 3, we had 8 last year, we have 5 this year. So that's cumulative, we have 16 there. And then in 23-24, these are the total numbers of English language eligible students by town. So you can see they are varying. Sheldon's got the heaviest hit, followed closely by Enosburg. And then we have some in Bakersfield, one in Berkshire, one in Richford. These are recommendations in terms of direct instruction and service hours. So if we were meeting that, it would be based on our numbers, we would need about 66 hours per week of direct instruction with those students, and we have one full-time teacher right now. So our proposal was to add the second full-time teacher. So you can see she just gave you a WIDA, which is kind of like the, I don't know what it stands for. I should have looked that up before I came here, but it's when you assess English language learners, you use the WIDA assessment. They're kind of like the standards for English language learning. So this just talks a little bit about the hours of instruction a week students need at each grade level.
Lynn, and this recommended direct instruction by hours, is this is based on kind of what the research shows
Yeah.
as far as what's needed to help these children be successful?
But I think she did this specific to our data, so the number of students who are at each of these levels. So that would equate to, if we offered that 3 hours a week, what that would equate to for levels 1 through 5 and consulting.
And those teachers, they do a fair amount of direct
Yes.
instruction where kids are being pulled, but aren't they also helping classroom teachers understand how to better serve that population
Yes.
also?
Yes,
Yeah, so that's a heavy lift for one person.
yes, it sure is, because that
Yeah.
one person is spread right now across, 5 towns.
Right.
So, and I don't actually know how many schools, I'm assuming most of the schools, but she didn't do it out by the number of schools. So, the other piece is our instructional coaches. We have a total of 3 instructional coaches serving right now between 35 and 45, I think is what the data we got today was, new educators this year. So that is a heavy lift for those instructional coaches. So that is one of the strategies that has a direct impact on teacher practice and would have a direct impact on student learning as a result of that. The last piece that you had added in there was, that was in the FNESU budget, was the Director for the Advancement of Educational Equity, Michelle Irish. And one of the things I just want to put out there is there are things that Michelle is doing that might not be as visible. In addition to the work around equity, she is also our homeless coordinator. She also coordinates everything that has to do with our emerging multilingual learners. And she also will play a role most likely next year in the curriculum work. So as we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy, Michelle will play a role in helping to support that work in the SU as well. So the question is, how far do you want us to go?
I have a clarification question. Morgan, that ASP piece, if we shifted things around, what could potentially be the savings and amount to
So
pull
the
down the budget
savings-
related to that?
Yeah, the savings would be at the district level, not the SU level.
Okay.
Because whatever we budget for here, we're just parting it out to the 2 districts.
Understood, okay.
So it doesn't reduce the assessment if you make that cut. What it would do is in your local budgets, it would increase your guidance lines a little bit, and it would decrease that ASP line.
Yeah.
And so I am thinking that the net savings is somewhere around 130,000, but I wouldn't want to be quoted on that yet. I'm still digging into that.
What would be the total savings with everything?
Well,
very well in
if
about
the
3
total
more
savings,
seconds.
if we, of the 55K down for food service, 93K down for the HR assistant, 20K down related to Leah's shift and job, the role and the
Number of days.
number of days, plus the 217K if we were to eliminate the FPA, but needing to maintain those teachers that help us keep our special programs, alternative programs running, that's 385K.
And then if you add in the other pieces, so on this list, we did not put all of the instructional coaches. I would, if we had to make a cut with the instructional coaching line, I would hope that we could cut one and not all of them. One would be a hard enough hit, but it is very hard to support new teachers. And I don't think principals have the capacity to do it on their own. Because these are new teachers. These are people who worked at, we've got one educator who's, working really hard, but, worked in the retail field and had a bachelor's degree and then came on as a teacher and is in the classroom and is learning what it means to be a teacher in real time. That's the reality of our workforce right now.
How many instructional coaches again?
3 for all 9 schools.
That's not a lot.
So I guess just taking a step back to like the 30,000 feet as someone who hasn't done this before, do we have a sense of what number are we trying to get to that would move the needle?
Do you want to talk about how much to buy it down by a penny on each side?
I can do that. And again, it's a little bit odd because you represent a board and you oversee a budget that the voters don't vote on, right? So it's really your roles as the local budgets where you, where you're gonna see, where you're gonna be trying to interpret the voter's message, and you may come up with different answers depending on which side of the ER and MV divide that you're in. On the Enosburg-Richford side, to move that budget a penny, you would need to cut about 170,000. You could also raise revenue by 170,000, but you need to move that ed spending figure by 170,000. I think on the NMV side, it's a little bit higher.
You said 200?
It's just under 200. So about 206,000 to move it a penny. If the yield moves $90, NMV's budget moves a penny, and so relatively small changes in the yield may also have that same effect. It's about the same on the Enosburg-Richford side.
So does that mean, Morgan, that we could potentially start with fewer cuts that lower the SU budget a bit and the assessment to the local districts, and then see how the local districts approach their respective budgets? And if there are some efficiencies to be found or cuts that happen at the local level, plus what we feel we could potentially do without a lot of harm caused to the SU budget. I mean, am I understanding that connection between the SU assessment? I mean, because if you're saying the penny for Enosburg-Richford and the penny for NMV, 170K and 206K respectively, we're essentially there just with this 385 from the SU
Yeah.
from the SU budget, with these things that don't cause the cuts aren't quite as deep and potentially as harmful as far as opportunities and for our students and support for our staff and teachers. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are understanding that correctly. I would say politically the question for all 3 boards is whether, given the 2 defeats you feel it's important to show some kind of cut to your voters. Certainly the NMV budget vote was close enough that tactically it would not be crazy to say we think we can go forward with the same budget and get a different result. That margin was small enough. Enosburg, Richford, the margin's a little bit bigger, communities are different, and so different conversation there. But I think the question is, do you have to show at least some belt tightening at each level?
Oh, I agree, and I
Even if
wasn't
it's token.
suggesting that we
Yeah.
wouldn't, but I was suggesting if there was a way to spread it across all three budgets so that it's not quite as onerous for just one, i.e. the SU
Mhm.
budget. But so if this amount, like if what we just discussed, these kind of the lower hanging fruit here amounts to that 385.
Right.
that-
And it doesn't go back to the districts equally because it's not
Right,
assessed
of
50/50.
course.
So $100,000, if you cut the SU budget $100,000, Enosburg, Richford's assessment would be down roughly 60, and NMV's would be down roughly 40.
Yeah,
So it's going to drop a little faster on the Enosburg, Richford side
right,
because they pay more of the assessment.
gotcha. Because it serves a larger population.
More kids, yeah.
Yeah,
I just wonder if we are careful about how much here, because if it goes down again, you already cut a big chunk of that, then you're cutting into even more. So I'm wondering if we look at food service, the HR assistant, and the shift in the no co-director at 168, which almost gets you to the 170. And that way, if we have to come back again, hopefully not, like, then we haven't cut into that flexible pathways and the ELL. And I wonder if the shifting of the after-school program, the guidance, sounds like it should happen, but I wonder if doing it right now when things are a little tumultuous might look weird to some people. So I'm just wondering if we should hold that. Those are just my thoughts.
I hear that. I definitely feel maintaining and keeping in that other EL teacher feels really important. And like the moral right thing to do for our community. I do question the FPA, and not because it hasn't served a really valuable role, especially through the pandemic, but it is serving a really small population of students and families. And I don't know quite how to thread that needle as far as, I'm not saying it's not valuable to that small group of people, but it is a pretty large amount to spend for the relative impact.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where my head went as well, is the FPA. I mean, we would get the greatest bang for our buck as far as that's concerned. And Morgan, I just wanted to circle back just to clarify. So you delineated what it would take to get to 1 cent. But so do you feel like for each board that should be the goal to move the needle, or do we need to do more than that?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a board decision based on kind of your read of the communities. I'm using 1 cent because I think it helps put it in.
To define it, I agree.
Hard numbers.
So do we have any community engagement data feedback? I mean, do we have anything, any sense of what the community is looking for besides individual conversations?
We've just got the anecdotal conversations. One of the things that I was going to talk to the ER board about tonight is whether or not you should launch a survey to
Yeah.
see what the community has to say. I think that's the budget that certainly there was a stronger message on that side, and I again think that a large part of that, I mean, I literally hope this room fills in the next 10 minutes. I want people to come and be a part of this conversation because I think it's so important. Until you sit down and you look at all of it, it's really hard to understand the total picture. So I would love to hear from them, but at the same time, one of the things we'll talk about is how we're thinking about engaging with the community in a different way as we go up to our second budget vote. Because I
Yeah.
think we've struggled to get people to watch information online, to come out in person. So we're gonna have to think about how we do that differently.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's one of the things that I came with thinking is that we've got to get a better read on what the community is asking from us.
I think my perception from what I've heard is there's a central office perception, not understanding what's in that budget. I think that's a historical frustration for people because we're in a supervisory union. So in a supervisory union, you don't vote on that part of the budget. That's an assessment out to each of the districts. So I know that, like I've known that for decades, that's a frustration. And I think also it's the tax rates and the impact of the CLAs. And I think that's the piece that is so difficult for communities to understand is with the craziness in the real estate market and the huge spikes in property values, that this is having a tremendous impact on taxpayers because those drops in the CLA are really felt by the taxpayers. And I think that they're equating that to, all of that to school spending. And I would love to have them come out and listen to the conversation we just had.
So, I mean, I want to be mindful of the time, and I know you all have a meeting starting in 5 minutes ostensibly. So it seems to me, I mean, we're obviously going to have another meeting. I think it'll be helpful if it's after the ER discussion tonight and the NMV discussion next Wednesday, so that we can see where those boards get to with the conversation around the district budgets. But it does seem as though there's some degree of consensus from the SU board that at least the food service savings, the HR and the shift with Leah, and possibly the FPA, which I think not everyone is in alignment around that. But as far as kind of taking the temperature of the board on those pieces.
I think that'll help guide the conversation at the ER board, because at least we would have like scenario number 1 and a scenario number 2 as we start to dig in to the ER numbers, and then we'll have NMV next week. So
Right.
we probably should schedule an SU for next week as well. Sorry, Courtney, I know you've been doing a lot of scheduling. You could also choose if I know there's a lot of meetings out in the next, well, let's say 6 weeks, because that's good. That's the reality of putting another budget forward. You could choose to do it virtually if you didn't want to come in person.
Yes.
We could be in person at central office and do it.
I think that would be great. It may not be, I mean, if we're meeting on Wednesday, it might need to be the week after for the SU, but if it could be a virtual meeting, well, although we've got support staff and then negotiations the following week, so we could time it around that too, since some of us will be in person.
So my other wonder is if we do move superintendent negotiations to Wednesday, could you do that first and then shift into the budget meeting since you'll all be together anyway?
On Wednesday the
mean,
20th,
Not
Wednesday the, oh, next Wednesday you mean? Or the Wednesday
Tuesday,
after?
I'm sorry, Tuesday.
Oh,
It was
okay.
gonna be a Monday or Tuesday.
What's the date?
So my wonder is support staff negotiations. I still have to work on that.
Yeah.
But my think is it has to be next week because, not next week.
The week, Monday the 25th.
Holy cow, there's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay, forget me.
I think it's the
I'm-
25th that
I'm
you're
2
talking
weeks
about.
out.
Yeah.
You're aiming for the 25th, and I have no idea when you're talking about line negotiations.
Yeah, so I was skipping a week. I was
Okay.
thinking support staff negotiations for the 25th, and then I was thinking superintendent negotiations on the 26th.
So I think if at all possible, we're in SU, we're butting up against when we at least need to get ER warned, because we think we have that longer warning period there. So I think we have to have that finalized by, is this yours? Grab that folder. 27th, we want to get them done because it has to be in the paper by the 29th, Morgan, the 30th, is that
Has to be
right?
in the paper on the 29th.
So do we want to punt the superintendent negotiations and claim that Tuesday, the 26th for the SU
Is that,
instead?
I'm only wondering because you can't really finalize either of the other two districts until we know what the SU is doing.
Yeah.
So we don't have, if the SU doesn't come back until the 26th, then it's after those last two. So it would be better if, because we have our second NMV meeting on the 20th,
Second ER on Monday.
second ER on the 18th.
Right.
Better to get in before that.
What?
Be better to get in before the 18th then.
I mean, you also could give us a direction tonight, and then if you get a sense from your second NMV and your second ER that you want to come back to this and make a change, either side could say, go back, relook at the FNESU budget.
So are you saying we get a sense tonight at those local meetings, we bring back a lower assessment based on what we've found? And then as long as the local boards are both good with that, we don't really have to meet
Right.
timely?
Otherwise, you're going
Okay.
to have to meet next week, or no,
Yeah.
this week. Yeah. This week.
I mean, you feel like, I'm sorry, I'm not understanding why we don't want to first have the two individual district meetings first to
You
see.
can, but I would want your SU meeting to be before the second NMV and the second ER, because you'd want to lock in whatever you're doing with the FNESU budget to inform the second NMV and the second ER, because you need to know how their assessment is going to change before they can warn their budgets. You see what I'm saying?
What do you mean by second? Like, our NMV meeting is on the 20th,
Correct.
and the Enosburg one is today.
And
The first one.
Oh, okay, that I wasn't clear to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so you all have another one on the 18th, in addition to the meeting you're having
Yes.
now.
So this will be their first meeting tonight.
And we don't have a second NMV one scheduled yet.
The 20th is your second one, because you've already taken a look at this, at your March 6th meeting.
Yeah, okay. So,
So if we go after the 18th or the 20th, it doesn't inform those two boards. So it would mean that whichever board came after SU would then have to have a third meeting. And we think, at least for ER, that we need to get that warned
mhm.
by the end of the month.
Can we meet on the 19th,
I think you're saying
or
before
tomorrow? I
She's
mean,
saying
tomorrow- it would-
before the 18th,
what
so
about
it would have to
tomorrow?
be, yeah.
Another virtual, maybe a virtual one tomorrow evening?
We can't really do the 24-hour, it's too quick. So
Quick to
there's not
warn.
enough time to warn that. You
What about Thursday?
could do Thursday.
Can we do that virtually?
I could.
Although, I mean, I can come in person.
Morgan, what are you thinking?
I am, Michelle and Stacy and Melissa and I are presenting at someone's class on Thursday from 5 to 8. So I need to be out of that window.
Would people be open to a first thing in the morning meeting?
Or 5 o'clock on Monday before the ER meeting?
I mean, that could work.
Not 5 o'clock in the morning?
5 p.m. I can do that. I could do 4:30 if we wanted a little more time, but
We'll do, so we'll have a special ER meeting at central office. So you could either come, because you're gonna be coming for the ER meeting, you could come for the meeting there or join it. You might wanna come to the meeting there if you're coming for ER, but NMV could join virtually.
This is 5 o'clock, 5 o'clock on the 18th instead.
5 o'clock on the 18th. Okay.
Could you do 6? Or if not, I think it sounds like you have quorum without me.
6 is our ER.
Oh, 6 is your ER, yeah. So yeah, I can't.
Which and you're gonna be at? And you're gonna be at the ER meeting?
I don't have it on my calendar, but I'm sure I will. 6, I'm good for 6. I'll have to just do it virtually. So, but you have quorum without me, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Sounds
We're changing it to 5 o'clock, right?
Did you send me that?
All right. Okay.
Makes sense?
Yeah. Makes sense. All right, any other discussion, questions from folks? Okay, I'll make a motion to adjourn. Kat?
Cat is off now.
Oh, Kat is off. Okay, so all in favor?
Hi.
Great, thank you.